I want to welcome Colonel Lawrence Wilkerson. Colonel Wilkerson was a 31-year veteran of the Army who, during his time, served as special assistant to Colin Powell, both as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and when he was Secretary of State. Colonel Wilkerson, for 17 years, was the distinguished visiting professor of government and public policy at College of William and Mary, and he is currently a fellow at the Eisenhower Media Network and a member of Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. We're very pleased to have him with us tonight, and I want to turn it over to Colonel Wilkerson. Welcome.
Thank you. That's a moving speech. Please, audience, excuse me. I've got a really bad cold. It's a very moving speech. I've heard it several times. I'm moved by it every time I hear it. I want to thank you, Dr. Schatz and the Community Church of Boston, a historic venue to be sure, for inviting me back a second time, even if it is only artificially, virtually, via Zoom. And I want to thank the gathered audience for their attention and say that I wish I could be in Boston. It's a great city, and I'd love to be there again. I want to take a few moments and just parse the speech a bit, because it's so important given what's happening today. I'm sure many of your questions, and I welcome them, will be about what's happening today. After all, given that speech, most of what Kennedy asked for, most of what he called for, most of what he very eloquently described is dead. When Kennedy gave his historic speech in that summer of '63, slightly more than 5 months before he was brutally assassinated by a cabal of government and former government officials, the entire world stood still for a nanosecond. Now, I know as a somewhat learned man that while what I just declared might make for a poetic metaphor, it is geologically, physically impossible after all, but the metaphor makes my point dramatically despite its lack of scientific basis. I suspect that counting out certain ascetics and certain religious or otherwise in the clouds people, as we used to say in the Army, prophets or devil, no one in the 5,000 years of human history that we know something about who was in such an august position of state or tribal leadership, and certainly not the head of a so-called modern nuclear superpower, indeed the superpower, the United States, had ever uttered such a statement. You heard him call with clarion precision for world disarmament and world peace. To demonstrate the uniqueness and the danger of such a call from a sitting president of the United States of America, it's sufficient to note that, as I indicated, he was murdered 5 months later, which is about the approximate planning time and rehearsal time required for such a momentous and successful assassination. Admittedly, certain of those planners, so utterly dissatisfied with President Kennedy for not electing to use the military option in October 1962 and invade the island of Cuba, risking nuclear holocaust, might have initiated their part of the planning much earlier. But the bulk of the team, as it were, took longer to assemble and were ultimately persuaded to go all the way, I think, by Kennedy's remarks that summer of '63, remarks we just listened to. That, too, to me, is very clear. That the nation has not officially recorded these events as having transcribed, as I've just described, makes a little difference. Those who've done the research, I think, know it's true. Why were his remarks, and here we come to the meat of the matter, so explosive, so volatile, so existentially threatening to the oligarchical, warmongering corporatocracy that since World War II has increasingly come to be and now is the real power in America? Well, first, Kennedy declared, you heard him from the presidential pulpit, that the most important topic on earth was world peace. That's a direct quote. Imagine the shockwaves sent out through the airways to men such as Paul Nitze, Allen Dulles, General Curtis LeMay, Even such stellar lights as Dwight Eisenhower, who abominated Allen Dulles, by the way, and Harry Truman, who, when Kennedy was later murdered, wrote one of the few, almost immediate accusatory op-eds, December, I think it was, a couple of months after the assassination, directing his ire straight at the Central Intelligence Agency, which, however, reluctantly he had created. Now, there was one other individual that came out with an even more immediate response. And if you want to read it, it's eloquent. It's quite long, it's quite detailed, it's quite precise, but it's eloquent. And it was rendered by Fidel Castro, then the president of Cuba. I believe it's safe to say that at that time that he spoke at American University, no one in the security complex, lots of applause from the audience, but no one from the security complex of the great superpower was not shocked to the marrow of his or her bones. But there is more to come, and it's worth quoting in full again as the president described what he meant by peace. What kind of peace do I mean, he rhetorically asked. Not a Pax Americana, not something forced by America, not something enforced on the world by our weapons of war. Think about what we're doing today with our weapons of war and others by proxy with our weapons of war, Ukraine and Gaza and Israel on Gaza in particular. He talked about not the peace of the grave or the security of the slave. He was talking about genuine peace, the kind of peace that makes life on earth worth living, the kind that enables men and nations to grow and to hope and to build a better life for their children. Think about Gaza. Not merely peace for Americans, but peace for all men and women, including the Soviets. Not merely peace in our time, but a peace for all times. These sterling words were anathema to the complex that had come to run America, that owned our Congress lock, stock, and barrel, that dictated the nation's foreign and security policies, that indeed dictates, in the present sense, our very life today. What more did he say? He trod into the sacred ground of visceral hatred, of sinful propaganda, of unheard of all vitriol toward the Soviet devil. Well, think of Ukraine today and Vladimir Putin, the Soviet devil's replacement. But what did Kennedy say then? He said, among the many traits the people of our two countries have in common, none is stronger than our mutual reports of war. I think that's true. Almost unique among the major world powers, we've never been at war with each other. No nation in the history, and this is why the Soviets abhor war, no nation in the history of battle ever suffered more than the Soviet Union suffered in the Second World War. Compare those remarks of Kennedy to the absolute silence of our current president in that very regard at the recent D-Day ceremonies in France. The Soviets lost 20 million people. The Soviets drove the Wehrmacht, the finest operational army in the world at the time, from their defeat at Stalingrad all the way to Berlin, losing millions of people in the process. But they beat the Germans. Overlord and our invasion of Normandy, I'm sorry to say, was an afterthought. It helped, yes, but the people who beat the Germans and the reason they got to Berlin before we did were the Soviets. Kennedy went on, at least 20 million lost their lives, as I just said. Countless millions of homes and farms were burned or sacked. A third of the nation's territory, including 2/3 of its industrial base, was turned into a wasteland, a loss equivalent to the devastation of this country from Chicago to the east. Think about that for a moment. These were startling admissions of the truth, but there was more, even more devastating to the Cold War warriors to whom the president, I think, addressed them. He spoke of world disarmament and world peace, and of getting well started by banning nuclear tests, of a treaty regime to outlaw such tests. What have we done today? We have abrogated every single treaty with regard to nuclear weapons that we had in the world, to include the INF Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which banned an entire class of nuclear weapons, the most dangerous weapons in the whole inventory. He announced that the forthcoming talks to get that treaty would be in Moscow, not in Geneva or London or Washington, Moscow. Likewise, he announced that America would lead the way by ceasing such tests immediately. All of this was heresy to the warmongers proliferating in our government. when the president went on to say categorically that the world knew that the United States would never start a war, that's a direct quote, could he know that the future America would not only mock his words, but start multiple wars simultaneously and use proxies to start others? Recall that I said first the president talked of peace, and indeed he did, in terms no American president had ever used. But second, and again in startling rhetoric, he spoke of these most dangerous weapons ever invented, the ones affected by his test ban treaty, nuclear weapons, certainly the greatest and indeed final threat to peace in all of human history. Now, this speech of Kennedy's, this courageous outpouring of what I believe was a small kernel in his mind, even as he labored to save the lives of the crew of his PT boat, PT 109. Old people like me remember that, in the waters of the Pacific after a Japanese destroyer had rammed it on the night and morning of 1 and 2 August in 1943. From that time on, this speech was in his mind, I think, or this concept was in his mind, as I would like to think it's in every soldier's mind, and I use soldier to describe all service members. This speech was spectacularly out of sync with the ideas of the U.S. security establishment, not the people wearing uniforms, not the people shedding their blood. Just as was Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence out of sync with the majority of Americans, who were, yes, a small majority, but a majority were either British sympathizers or what we called at the time Tories. That is to say, they thought George III was the rightful ruler. And they thought that men like Jefferson were insane at best and rank traitors to King George at worst, which is what make the final words of the Declaration of Independence so powerful that we celebrate, I hope, today. In fact, in my view, the most powerful words in the document, but I didn't come to that view on my own. I was led to that view by Colin Powell, a true admirer of Jefferson and of Jefferson's writings and his infrequent speeches as president. A black man. Powell once pointed out this reality to me in his mind, and it came that way to me afterward in rather dramatic fashion. He simply asked me one day what stood out most poignantly in the Declaration of Independence. And as I recall, I said the words encapsulating the right of a free people to set aside or even overthrow their existing government should they find it interfering with their rights as a free people. He said, okay, well, that was not the case with him, though certainly those were important words. The thrilling words to him were these: and for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. That was a soldier speaking. Powell went on to explain that each of these individuals had every reason, Jefferson, Washington, Hamilton, every one of them, had every reason, indeed the weight of evidence was heavy in this regard, to believe that at the end of the day, they would find themselves swinging from the yardarm of a British man of war in Boston Harbor. After all, they were taking on the greatest empire in the world, and they really had nothing but their words. Powell then pointed out to me the most important part, the stated progression of assets they pledged to one another. Their lives, the least important, their fortunes, more important because that meant their families, and finally, their sacred honor, the most important thing of all. Because without honor, there was no reason to exist. Imagine if one asserted such a concept today when there is so little honor that it is accurate to say the concept is dead. But JFK would have agreed with Powell, and I believe would have said that his honor demanded that after he had experienced the Berlin crisis, actually more serious than Cuba, and then the Cuban crisis, each of which took the world to the brink of nuclear war. In other words, when he had seen into the pits of hell and human extermination, he was honor bound to do something about it. And so he did, starting that day at American University. And the modern day Tories of America saw to it that he did in fact swing from the yardarm of their man of war in Dallas in November in 1963. We should, all of us, get down on bended knee and pray to whatever providence we hold dear, or to the great mother in the sky, if need be, or whatever we call greater than ourselves, for another such man or woman in the Oval Office who will pledge his or her life, fortune, and sacred honor to such a goal. There is so much at stake here. Not only the liberal democratic republic our forefathers started here just shy of 2.5 centuries ago on this day, but the world is at stake. Because unlike all the empires of the past 3,000 years, in fact, unique among all empires of all earthly time of which we are even remotely aware, none had developed the technological skills to obliterate themselves and their planet. Indeed, except for religious zealots and their believers, only some sort of divine being was attributed with such a capacity for wholesale destruction of human existence. But we alone among thousands of human civilizations, we developed the apparatus to completely wipe out the world. Moreover, we built and built and built the tools of that apparatus until the total number of warheads approached 60,000 in 1989. Sheer insanity. In 1991, as the Cold War came to a rather abrupt end, we set out with great determination to eliminate as many warheads as possible in that almost mystical interlude in our insanity. And we made great progress. We eliminated more than 40,000 warheads, but then the insanity overwhelmed us once again. And now, here we are. And now the nuclear weapon states are 9. And not only building weapons again, we and they are making even more dangerous ones. And we have canceled all of the treaty regimes we established in the Cold War. We, the United States of America, have canceled them. There's nothing remotely restraining us now. Likewise, we're engaging in proxy wars such as Ukraine. Remember what Kennedy said? We must never do this, where one of the belligerents is a nuclear weapons power. Nay, 2 of the belligerents. Must I say 3 or 4, counting France and London? We all have nuclear weapons, and Russia is looking increasingly at us as being in the war. Putin just established what we think is a no-fly zone over the Black Sea, a highly escalatory move, if it's true. Frankly, there seems no limit today to our insanity. A few years ago, I came across this statement from a renowned American scientist. First, he stated what I have stated, that, quote, we are the first civilization in human history to develop the means of our own wholesale destruction. That is a technological marvel of the first order, but it is accompanied by a telling question. Do we have the wisdom to control it? Unquote. Let me say that again. Do we have the wisdom to control it? To me, that is the most important question of this 4th of July. It is crucial that we get to work answering it in the affirmative, especially if we care about our children and our grandchildren celebrating such a singular holiday in the future as we do now. You could rightfully claim it is the challenge of not our particular age, but the challenge of all ages for all time. We must pay a decent respect to the opinions of all of humanity. John Fitzgerald Kennedy knew that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much.